So it's lovely to be here and great to see members of the group here today. So first of all, just to be clear, our group is still going very strong. This is just about our experiences up until now. Next slide, please. So first I'm going to talk about the history and membership of the group and then outline some examples of the great presentations that we've heard so far. I will then outline in detail some burning issues and key challenges that have come up in the group as Janet requested, sketch our plans for the future, and finally open up the floor for discussion and questions. Next slide, please. So we are a network of archivists and IT experts from many different countries who've come together to discuss projects and best practices concerning database archiving with a strong but not exclusive focus on eArch. And as you just heard, I myself am an archivist and not an IT expert, so specifically technical questions after the talk are best directed to the tech experts from the group who are here today. So the group began when I emailed Brett Abrams from the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington at the end of 2021 for more information about some slides that he had published about working with eArch. At the time, there was very little experience with using eArch and/or the database preservation toolkit in Germany. This turned into a fascinating dialogue, which was soon joined by the National Archives of Estonia, beginning with Kuldar, from whom we've just heard, and his team. The Estonians suggested more contacts for the group, and it began to mushroom. The group continues to grow in an organic way, with members nominating new members. NERA are unfortunately currently on hiatus, but we hope to be able to welcome them back in the fullness of time. We've really benefited from their fantastic input over the years. So I don't have a reliable number of individuals who are in the group because the membership is pretty fluid, so different individuals pop in and out of meetings. But I do have a list of the institutions involved. These are the German, Swiss, Danish, Norwegian, Finnish, Slovenian, Latvian, and Czech National Archives, the archives of the former State Security in Hungary, the KOST in Switzerland, the EU Publications Office, the archives of the Max Planck Society, the Municipal Archives Institution's Digital Resource Center in Trondheim, and the intercommunal archives for Møre and Romsdal, also in Norway. As you can see on this slide, I had some fun with flags. Next slide, please. So we have no cap on membership, so if your institution isn't a member and would like to join, let me know. It's free to be involved. No one is ever forced to present or given any tasks, so the name working group only refers to members sharing the work that they are doing anyway, but only if they want to. So it's also perfectly fine to just come and listen. So involvement with the group does not mean imposing further work on you. This is an important point considering how understaffed many archives are, and especially in this field. So we meet roughly once a month and I send out the invites. It's not necessary to RSVP in order to join the meeting, though many do, but you can just pop in as your schedule allows. We usually have a talk offered in advance by a member of the group, so if you want to give a talk, you do have to let me know that ahead of time. And then that will then allow you to use the group as a sounding board. We discuss the presentation together, and quite often helpful workarounds for technical problems have come out of these discussions. Sometimes, if we don't have a talk scheduled, we've had a meet up for a cup of tea and a more general discussion of current work and issues. So although the group is very laid back, it's also extremely interesting and productive. Next slide, please. So in terms of the presentations that we've had, I'm not going to give an exhaustive list, and certainly not a best of, because we've had a lot of them and they've all been fantastic. Just to give you some idea of the range we've covered so far, we've had talks by NERA about using eArch and the DBPTK to archive databases of wild horses in the American interior, while the Estonian National Archives has presented, among other things, about the use of eArch and the DBPTK to archive building registry data. The question of use has come up specifically a number of times, and the National Archives of Slovenia and the Czechs have demonstrated the use of DB DipView, which we're also hearing about later on today, while the Danish National Archives has presented on the use of its legacy system, Sophia, to render database content for researchers. We'll be hearing from them shortly on their newest work on making databases accessible. The Estonian National Archives has also shown us a special project on the use of multi-temporal databases, which I think we'll hear more about later too. Next slide, please. Appraisal has been discussed, but usually in the context of a whole project. I would say that overall we have talked more about how the end use cases will influence the various choices made along the way, including appraisal. Although the focus has mostly been on CEARD, we've had a number of talks on other subjects. For example, the archives of the former Hungarian state security have showcased their experiments with Kronos. We've also had presentations from industry professionals, such as from the developers of the database preservation toolkit at Keeps, and from Hub for Everybody, which focuses on the publishing and use of geodata. Next slide, please. Janet asked me about the major challenges of database archiving and working with CEARD as they've come up in the group. So I'm now going to take them in the order in which they appear in the process of archiving a database. So finding out which databases actually exist in the first place can be a significant challenge. And we've heard from specialists about the various ways in which they identify them. This will vary according to whether you have a centralized IT registry, like the Estonians or the Danes, or you don't, as is often the case in German federal states. In Germany, some state archives have invested a lot of time and resources in sending out repeated surveys to government departments about their databases that have not been answered properly, if indeed at all. I found, by contrast, that in cases where budgetary approval has to be granted by a central government office for IT applications, it is possible in this way to find the names of the technical supervisors of these applications and then in targeted interviews find out more about the other databases in their respective agencies, which naturally leads on to the next point, which is appraisal. Once it's been ascertained which databases exist, they must be archivally appraised. Determining which databases are archivally valuable and then which parts of the archivally valuable databases should be accessioned is also a significant challenge. Approaches differ from each other substantially, and it appears that appraisal of structured data will vary significantly depending on the broader context and the technological resources available. Because of this, I think that it may not be possible or even perhaps desirable to establish an orthodoxy on database appraisal. For example, some archives take all the content in the database, while others specifically exclude the administrative side. Some also consider future use at this stage by archiving additional views of parts of the information that don't contain sensitive data. One burning question that has turned up from time to time in the appraisal context has been poor data quality, which seems to be a depressingly common issue in government systems due to lack of quality control and many data inputters. Another problem is that if the data itself is inputted by the public, for example, to report incidents, this can produce a very unrepresentative picture if there is inconsistent uptake. My personal favorite example of this was a database that I appraised on gobbling incidents perpetrated by wildfowl on farmers' property in northern Germany. Only the farmers in one part of the region used this application to report these incidents, which led to the false impression that environmental destruction caused by wildfowl was only a problem in this particular area. What role should our knowledge of poor data quality play in appraisal? Do we write off databases that contain poor or unrepresentative information, or do we alert the user to the fact that they cannot necessarily rely on the content? This is particularly difficult because there seems to be a widespread cultural assumption that database contents have high empirical value, sometimes more than that of actual records, although I'm not sure why. If the archive has no technical staff, it may also be hard for it to determine whether the information is of good quality or not. It's often wise to ask the database's technical supervisors what their opinion is. Then there are specific problems with getting the CEARD file itself generated. So once the application and its information have been appraised, the CEARD file itself must be produced. Here, problems have arisen with government agencies surrounding IT security, espionage, and data protection concerns. Because of these reasons, some archives have had difficulty convincing agencies to install third-party boutique software like the DBPTK to create the transfer. One way around this that we have discussed is generating the CIARD file from a clone of the application on a non-networked computer. Next slide, please. Dealing with LOBs, large objects, and geodata when creating the transfer is also an issue that's come up a lot, as is validation, which must be done once the CIARD file has been made and which poses its own challenges. NERA has its own tool called eARK, Archival Electronic Records Inspection and Control, which checks descriptions of the data against the data themselves. The DBPTK itself includes a validation feature that's very useful. It requires some expertise to navigate, as the validation is premised on the current valid versions of the database formats, and not the legacy ones that are often encountered when archiving databases. This can lead to a number of invalid warnings that are actually not true for the transfer, and isolating the real problems simply requires more experience with the DBPTK to get used to which warnings are valid and which are not. Then there is the documentation of the materials. So what and how much metadata do we need? To what extent can and do archivists try to decode column names for users? And finally, use, the different ways of making databases available, for example, whether and how to generate single-use copies for researchers, or whether to make the content freely accessible over the internet, as NERA has done in a couple of examples. Approaches here, again, will vary significantly, and this will depend in part on the legislative context. Next slide, please. So, even more challenges. One of the biggest problems that has been mentioned is the need for more research and development to enable compatibility between the various CR tools that exist that we've already heard about today. It was suggested by Slovenia that if tools for CR database archiving are not compatible with each other, this could negatively influence the uptake of the standard. However, the group is quite optimistic that over time the software developers will find answers. The other big issue is how to deal with the formats that are not compatible with the CIARD software. We've discussed, for example, transforming them into CIARD with a different kind of software, such as Spectral Core, and we'll be hearing a detailed talk about that in the group at the beginning of September. Staffing is an issue that comes up too, particularly the need for tech backup to problem solve. Of course, under-resourcing is an issue for archives in general, not just with regard to database archiving, but the special skills needed for it are actually pretty rare. Next slide, please. So right now we're putting together a small handbook on database preservation based on the minutes from the meetings to date. This will be aimed at archivists with an affinity for tech but no significant technical backup who are getting started in the field. It will not be highly technical, partly because the field changes so quickly, which would soon render the handbook out of date, and partly because bug fixes and so on are best found on GitHub. Again, working on the handbook is not compulsory for the group's members. Those who want to be involved are invited to do so, but it's also fine if members don't have the time for this kind of commitment. Next slide, please. Overall, our impression is that CIARD, which has by now established itself as an international standard, has made database archiving far more feasible than it used to be, and there is currently quite a bit of optimism in the field, even though many archives are not as well resourced to deal with database archiving as they would like to be. The main takeaway from our experience is that international collaboration is not only a lot of fun, but offers real practical help for those involved in this field and can, in particular, assist archives that don't have sufficient tech support. Next slide, please. So many thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to welcome any questions.